Friends, my name is Cameron. Welcome to my channel. Today I have a multiple of stories for you. All these stories have one thing in common. The victim or the children at some point during their ordeal were frozen to death. So I'm going to start in May 2007. Joshua Mauldin and some of his family were staying at a motel in Galveston, Texas. Now Joshua, he was left alone with his 2-month-old daughter in the motel room. However, when Joshua's family returned, someone called 911. You see, according to the responding paramedic, the baby, his child, had second marks on her face, her ear, and her hand. After providing several versions of what happened to the baby, Joshua ultimately confessed he had taken the baby from bed to bed. He then assaulted her. He put her in the safe of the motel room. He took her from the safe. He then put her in the freezer. He then took her from the freezer and put her in the microwave. Yes, freezer and then microwave. He forced her in, shut the door. Now this case is so rare that there's barely any details. You see, as he went to court, the jury rejected his theory that he was insane at the time of the incident. And you're probably thinking, you know what? I don't need to be a psychiatrist to determine for someone to do what he did, you must be insane. However, they thought he was of sound mind, and they also classified the microwave as a deadly weapon. Now, in the punishment phase, the state called Dr. Harry Faust. He was a psychiatrist who saw Joshua at the county jail. They also called Dr. Shana, who was another psychologist with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. You also had Sergeant Don Hollingsworth, who testified about when he arrived on the scene. They all revealed that there was a domestic violence incident in 2006 involving Joshua and a carer for the baby. Joshua himself called Dr. Michael Fuller, who was an associate professor of psychiatry. He testified about Joshua's potential for rehabilitation and amenability to treatment in the community. His mother also testified about supporting him if he were placed on community supervision. However, the court instructed the jury that the range of punishment was 5 years to 99 years. Essentially, he could have gotten any sentence. The state themselves did argue for life in prison. The defense argued, among other matters, that Joshua suffered from mental illness and he had not caused a death because, of course, despite the bed and the freezer and the microwave, the child miraculously survived. So the defense suggested that community supervision was appropriate punishment. However, the jury looked at everything and they sentenced him to 25 years. In 2019, his parole hearing was dismissed and he will be released in 2032. Now, there's no other details that I could get of this case. I contacted that police and they said that the evidence they held gets destroyed after a certain period, which was in this case. However, Joshua, what were you thinking? I mean, we've all heard of the most insane crime cases. I don't think I've heard anything like that before, have you? Now I'm going to tell you about the case of Veronique Courjault. This is the case of the frozen babies, and it caused a sensation in France in 2006. You see, Veronique was convicted of taking the life of 3 of her babies. They were all boys between 1999 and 2003. You see, she gave birth to the children at home. She was alone. She removed the umbilical cords with her bare hands. She throttled the newborns with towels immediately after. She put the eldest baby's remains of the family home in France in 1999. And then she froze the cadavers of the other 2 children in 2002 and 2003 in her home in South Korea. From France, her and her husband moved to Korea in 2002. Now, to the onlooker, they appeared to be a very ordinary, respectable, middle-class couple, both in their early 40s. She was brunette, heavy-set, and had a shy demeanor. Her husband was slightly balding, of median height, and bears a kind, if worried, expression. They initially lived in a small village in a region of France. Her husband worked as an engineer for a US car parts company, and she as a part-time executive assistant. They had 2 teenage children. Now in 2002, the family moved to South Korea as Jean-Luc, the husband, was transferred there. Veronique became a stay-at-home mother, followed him with their 2 children to the city of Seoul, where many French expats lived. Now, although Jean-Luc had to travel frequently for his work, they led a good life, a normal existence in their home. In 2006, the family went back to France for summer holidays. Jean-Luc was unexpectedly called back to South Korea for urgent business, while Veronique and the children stayed in France. Now, one evening, he tried to find space for fish in the family freezer. So he's opening the freezer, rummaging around. There's frozen meats and vegetables. But then he noticed something. In the freezer, he saw a tiny human hand. On further exploration, he found not just 1, but 2 corpses of babies. They were side by side, wrapped in supermarket plastic bags. His immediate reaction was to call the police. This is one of the reasons why he would be cleared of complicity later. You see, at first, the couple denied any involvement, although Jean-Luc was questioned by South Korean investigators. His obvious shock diminished suspicions against him, and he was allowed to rejoin his family back in France. However, DNA tests would prove that the bodies were the dead infants' parents. In October 2006, Veronique finally confessed to the crimes and was remanded in custody, charged with murder. The couple pleaded for proceedings to be conducted behind closed doors in order to protect their living children from further distress. But the French judiciary refused, stating that the lessons could be drawn for similar cases were in the public's best interest. Throughout the hearings, Veronique repeatedly protested that her husband had been unaware of her actions and he was cleared from any involvement. You see, for Veronique, prosecutors demanded a life sentence, alleging she had premeditated the incidents and acted in cold blood. She was convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison in June 2009. Do you think 8 years was sufficient? Let me know. You see, in France, this verdict was seen as lenient by many. Of course. However, psychologists pointed to her evident mental illness and utter denial of all the pregnancies. At no time did she seek medical attention and did not tell another living soul that she was expecting. The very fact she kept the corpses in the freezer indicates she wanted them to be found. Perhaps she was crying out for help. That's a weird theory, don't you think? But you gotta ask, why did she do this? Because abortion has been legal in France since 1976. If abortion was not an option, why not use contraception at least after the first birth? See, psychiatrists involved in the case drew attention to her absolute refusal to admit she was pregnant. She said that unlike her first 2 pregnancies, she felt no connection with the fetuses and did not feel them moving inside her. Being naturally somewhat overweight, her shape did not alter much. Experts observed that this is common in pregnancy denial. The mind rejects what is happening in the body, so the pregnancy does not manifest itself in the normal way and remains hidden. When the babies are born, the mother does not view them as children, rather as extensions of her own body, which she needs to eliminate. The sufferer does not see contraception as necessary because a pregnancy is just not imaginable. You see, some believe that it was the influence of her childhood that led to the desperate acts. Her mother frequently voiced her despair and exhaustion at raising 7 children and having to work hard on the family vineyard. Money was tight, and her family members did not communicate or express emotion much. Perhaps Veronique wanted to avoid recreating the same atmosphere of silence. She stated that she and her husband agreed to stop after 2 children and she did not want any more. Others criticized her husband for being too absent, physically and emotionally, to notice his wife's distress, a notion he rejected. And I agree, it's not his fault. At the time, he was accused of working too much and spending all his free time cruising on his cherished motorbike. Jean-Louis admits that yes, sometimes he did not always pay attention to every dip in Veronique's humor. Now, Veronique was released in March of 2010 for good behavior, and because officials considered that she had served half her sentence, having been in custody since 2006, she was on conditional leave, which meant she must regularly check in with psychiatrists and the prison service responsible for the reinsertion of convicts in society. Now, as a requirement for her release, she was forbidden from speaking to the press until her conditional freedom term ended. However, after all of this, her husband released his side of the story. And at the time, critics said that in publishing this book, he was trying to clear himself of any involvement, protest his own innocence, but to the detriment of his wife. She was portrayed as mentally troubled, but the guilty part in their relationship. But there was another elephant in the room. He was accused of cashing in on the murders without sufficiently considering the feelings of his wife and children. In interviews at the time, he claimed to have a number of different goals in writing his tell-all book. He wanted to enlighten the public, to depict the distress of a powerless husband. He wanted to comfort victims of pregnancy denial and recount how he survived the case and aftermath. Importantly, he declared that he wanted answers to be available to his children when they asked questions. That's a lot of bollocks, to be honest. If you were concerned for your children, they could have just come to you and you could have spoken to them. However, him cashing in on it, if he is, that's not the crime. But I'm not a woman. I don't know what it's like to be pregnant. I've experienced childbirth, I've seen it, but I'm not a woman. So this idea of pregnancy denial, tell me, is that a real thing? Now I'm going to move on to the case of Alexis Aldamir. You will not believe what happens in the end of this one. So please keep listening. So on the afternoon of November 17th, 2022, Boston police responded to East Broadway in South Boston. There was a 911 call about a possible baby located inside a freezer. The call was later updated to involve multiple babies. The caller explained that he and his wife made the discovery while cleaning out his sister's apartment. The call began a comprehensive investigation involving the Suffolk County Attorney's Office, also the Boston Police, and their crime laboratory. In all, 4 babies were discovered that day. All were frozen solid. All were found in shoe boxes wrapped in tin foil. 2 were male and 2 were female. All of the babies were full term, which means they were determined to be between 37 and 40 weeks of gestational age. All 4 had their umbilical cords attached, and the 2 females had their placentas attached. DNA tests concluded that the babies were full siblings. The medical examiner reported that there was no scientific method to determine how long the babies had been frozen. The autopsy found no signs of internal or external trauma and no evidence of obvious injuries. There were no signs of food or milk or formula inside the babies' stomachs. The medical examiner found the cause of death for all the babies to be undetermined. The medical examiner also reported that it could not definitively determine whether the babies had been born alive. Now, after the discovery of the babies, investigators began working to find answers to many questions surrounding this discovery. they determined that the apartment was owned and occupied by Alexis Aldamir. She was 69, and she moved with her family from Maryland to the location in 1971 when she was almost 17 years old. Records show that Alexis purchased the South Boston apartment in 1983. Investigators located Alexis in a residential healthcare facility and eventually gained a court order to obtain a DNA sample. Now, the DNA results and subsequent analysis led investigators to conclude that Alexis is the mother of all 4 babies. What? Investigators also found that Alexis had worked for an accounting firm in Boston from March 1980 to October 2021. Co-workers who spoke with investigators described Alexis as a hard worker who rarely took vacations. They also said she was a heavy-set woman who had a penchant for wearing loose-fitting clothing regardless of the season. None of Alexis' co-workers knew her to be pregnant at any point. Investigators eventually learned who the likely father of the babies were and that he died in 2011. Investigators also determined that Alexis gave birth to a baby girl in April 1982. The birth certificate listed Alexis as the mother but did not include the father's name. Investigators also found 2 parental rights surrender forms, one signed by Alexis and the other signed by the individual determined to be the father of the 4 frozen babies. Investigators found no other records of Alexis giving birth. To summarize, investigators determined that Alexis had 5 children with the same man. They gave one of their children up for adoption. The other 4 were found in the apartment. So with the mother and the father of the babies now determined, the police's next step was to consider whether any crimes surrounding the discovery of the frozen babies could be proved. Here, police encountered several challenges. First, to charge any homicide, there must be evidence that the victims were alive. There must also be a cause of death determined by the medical examiner. In this case, investigators could not prove that the babies were ever alive, and they have no cause or manner of death. Secondly, the autopsy found no signs of internal or external trauma to the babies and no evidence of obvious injuries. Third, as the father is now deceased, he cannot be charged with any crime. Finally, there was the question, could Alexis go to trial? Well, in late 2022, police visited her healthcare facility. They questioned her about the babies found in her apartment, and throughout the interview, Alexis appeared confused and demonstrated a lack of understanding. As a result, she was unable to provide investigators with any significant information. The problem was that the prosecutor's office could not ethically move forward with a case that in good faith it believes cannot bring to trial. So based on the evidence obtained throughout this entire situation, including many unanswered questions, they made the determination that they would not be able to bring this to trial. Therefore, no criminal charges were put forward and nobody knows really what happened to the babies. Wowzers. Finally, we move on to the story of Katie Stockton. You see, the body of her daughter was discovered in December 2004 on property owned by Katie's mother and stepfather. The child, who had been born alive, was wrapped in clothing and had been placed in a plastic bag. Therefore, either hypothermia or suffocation from the clothing or plastic had caused the child's death. Evidence at Katie's sentencing hearing established that she was questioned by police and that she denied that the child was hers. But it wasn't until 2009 that police obtained a DNA sample from Katie showing that she was the child's mother. And DNA testing showed that John Craig, her partner, was the father. In the course of the investigation, police discovered the decomposed remains of 2 infants in the bags in the trunk of Katie's car. Who puts infants in their trunk? What? Genetic testing established that she was the mother of the 2 infants and that Craig was the father of one of them. Both were full term at birth, but it could not be determined whether they were born alive. Several witnesses testified that the bags in which the infants were found contained liquid from decomposition as well as maggots and insects. So, the county coroner, Elizabeth Fiducia, testified that she and the sheriff of the county gave the child the name Crystal. They explained that the child was found near Christmas on a crystal clear night. They took the child's handprints and footprints so that when the child's family was identified, they would have something to hold on to because they knew this child was real and it would make more real if they saw it. Craig testified that Katie told him that she was carrying his child. She later told him that she had a miscarriage. When Craig learned that the child had been born alive, he named her Maria Renee. So, in the trial, the state presented numerous photographs of the child at the site where her body was discovered in 2004. They also presented the child's autopsy report and the child in an open casket with stuffed animals. In the trial, to the jury, they showed the child's headstone and the decomposed remains of the infants later found in the trunk of Katie's car. The state introduced evidence that there were places such as hospitals, police stations, and fire stations where Katie could have left a newborn without fear of punishment. You see, in some states, they have these special boxes where if a baby is born and you don't want it, you can just go there and leave it. And looking at Katie's history a little bit, she had been convicted of forgery in 2008 and was sentenced to probation. But there were some in the trial who tried to help Katie. You see, her mother, Lisa Lanzi, testified for her. According to Lisa, Katie had a son when she was in her early 20s, and then in 2004 or 2005, Lisa suspected that Katie was abusing drugs and alcohol. In 2008, she was incarcerated for a short while, and after her release, she lived with Lisa. During this time, Katie helped around the house, took care of her son, and had 3 jobs. In her statement in allocution, Katie apologized for what she had done and asked for forgiveness. So in imposing the sentence, the trial court noted that there was no evidence that the children whose remains were found in the trunk of Katie's car had been born alive. Accordingly, the court stated that it would not consider the remains as evidence of an uncharged crime. However, the court indicated that concealing the remains in the car was arguably the act of a deranged individual. Eventually, Katie was sentenced to 50 years in prison. So, to recap, in the first case of Joshua, we know how stringent the requirement for insanity is in a court of law in America, actually in Europe too. The fact that they found him sane tells me he knew what he was doing. Why would you do that to a child? Remember? Freezer, microwave? What? As a man, in the case of Veronique, I cannot describe or try to understand her mental processes. Of course, as I've said, I've never been pregnant, but 8 years? That's way too lenient if you ask me. As for the case in Massachusetts with Alexis, who stuffed babies in her freezer for years and years, I mean, she knew she was pregnant. What was she doing? But it seemed by the time she was found, she was already in some kind of elderly home. And I get the feeling from that case, the police just could not be bothered to deal with it. Well, she's old. She's in a care home. What's the point dragging her out, putting her into prison on a case that, well, we're not even sure about what actually happened. And now with Katie, who, well, you know how they say, can't keep your dick in your pants. Well, I don't know what the female equivalent of that is, but it seems like she had multiple partners and had multiple babies and just didn't want them. 50 years, huh? Well, that's what you get. Anyway, comment. Tell me what you think about all these cases.